I'm Loki Karuna, and this is TRILLOQUY. Thanks for tuning in. I think I'm doing pretty good with the regular releases now. I think this makes 3 whole weeks in a row. I appreciate y'all sticking with me as I continue to traverse my expanded responsibilities as the so-called classical agitator. A reminder that you can learn more about this show, you can check out past opuses, and you can contribute to the work on our website. It's TRILLOQUY.org. I want to give a shout out to Aaron Dworkin, who's going to be featuring me this weekend on his show Arts Engines. I'll have a link to that in the description. Huge thanks to him for having me and for giving me the opportunity to talk about some of the work that I do with the American Composers Orchestra. It's interesting. This episode of Arts Engines is actually going to be platformed by one of my former employers. Interesting how good work always finds its way back where it belongs. Shout out to them as well. And of course, I want to shout out this week's guest, Lorin Green. So back in March of 2021, Lorin came on to the TRILLOQUY podcast to talk about her podcast. It's called Relative Pitch, and also to unpack some of the things that she was noticing in the arts regarding race, gender, and identity. One of the big things that we talked about back in that 2021 interview was an anthology that had recently caught her attention and inspired lots of her own thoughts on liberation and the arts and everything in between. Well, fast forward to today, Lorin has actually curated, edited, and published her very own anthology. It's called From Our Eyes and Ears. I had the pleasure of contributing to this book, as did many other arts activists and artists in the field. And we all today have the pleasure of hearing from Lorin to get some inside scoop on this anthology. She's going to read an excerpt from it. We're going to talk about where she sees the field as far as where it's headed in general. And I'm just so proud to count Lorin among the agitators out there in our world of so-called classical music. Really happy to share this chat with y'all today. To get us into it, we're going to celebrate Lorin's flute playing a bit. She's not only a publisher and editor and arts admin, she is, like many of us, a Western classically trained musician. There's a lot of beautiful music on her website for you to check out. And among those tunes is Lorin's rendition of a work called Danza de la Mariposa, music here by the legendary Valerie Coleman, as performed by this week's guest, Lorin Green. Hope y'all enjoy.
Going into it, I had no idea what a nonprofit was. And when I try to explain it to people, I'm like, well, it's not exactly what it sounds like. There is a profit being made, right? The for profits that we know, those big, large institutions that are just kind of holding money, they're doing it because they want to hold that money. The idea, though, for a nonprofit is that money is supposed to be going back into the world, into the community, doing the work that it says it is doing, right? And there are little holes, like everything, there's little ways that you can get around, like, oh, well, is all of that money going into the community? Of course not. And it can't, right? Because you have people on your staff and
Mm-hmm.
you have things to upkeep, you have your venue, you have your rental fees, all those things that you have to consider that profit is for. Now, within these institutions, because they are still institutions, there is a level of, this me, what can I give to myself that has happened? And you can see budgets, right? You can go online and see what your favorite CEOs have made in the past fiscal years. And maybe that'll give you a better idea about how these things are actually allowed to happen and what is happening. And I think it takes to tell people what, the average CEO, executive director of like especially a tier one symphony makes for them to really lock in. Is there really much of a difference between for profit and nonprofit? On paper, sure, but in reality, working within one, it can feel very similar between the both, truly.
I still remember the first time, and I don't want people to go doing research and pocket watching, so I'll keep this part anonymous. But years ago, I looked at the 990 of an orchestra and looked at the
Hmm.
salaries of a couple people, and I was next to myself. I mean, there are people making seven-figure salaries out
Yep.
here, and we are pulling together what we can.
Hmm. Exactly. Exactly. And it's a because there's this whole stigma, right? There's no money in the arts. There's no money in the arts, and I laugh. Honestly, at this point, when people tell me that, I laugh because I'm like, yes, there is, but it's going into the places you wouldn't expect that they're going, which is
Hmm.
the truth.
And speaking of where funding goes,
Mm,
there's been a lot of things to happen in the field since 2020. Before we started recording, we were talking about 4 years ago. I wonder if
right.
you could, from your perspective, describe the progress or lack of progress that you've seen over these past 4 years. Some would argue that we're almost back where we started.
Hmm. It's funny. I have to shout out my bestie and co-host Relative Pitch, Michael Brown, because his whole thing. Whenever we started our podcast actually in 2020 around this time, around like the late summer, fall, and something he initially said was, "Talk to me in 2026, and I'll tell you if it feels like we've actually, done anything." Because his mindset and a lot of people's mindset was that it was going to be a cycle, and there was going to be a lot of a peak, and then we're going to go right back into what was normal, right? What felt comfortable for I guess, the people who are making decisions. And unfortunately, I think while there's been a good amount of progress in terms of we do have more people in the spaces occupying space, um, even maybe within percentages, right? If you're looking at what the League of American Orchestras is reporting, there is an uptick. Now, the uptick is in itself unfortunate with how low it is, and the fact if you look at what the stats mean against the population, we are still very much underrepresented for Black Latinx musicians, Native American, like indigenous, like instrumentalist musicians within the orchestral field are very under the population percentage of America. And honestly, what's been happening from 2020, maybe a little bit before then, is these organizations are creating programs as a knee jerk reaction. So they see, oh, we have to do something, we have to respond, and they make a fellowship or they make some kind of internship or some kind of program saying, we're going to bring in diversity or we're going to bring in a chief diversity officer, right?
Mhm.
How many job titles have we seen floating around for chief diversity officer? And the issue is when you bring on these new programs and you actually don't have the structure or the foundation for it, it's like just it's like a branch that is so easily broken off of it's not actually there. It's not actually firmly a part of the structure of the organization. So just as easy, quote unquote, as it was for them to place it there, it's just as easy for that to be taken away in the long term or even in the short term, as we've seen with some. Um, so I've been monitoring, I've been seeing that wave of programs popping up, people popping up in certain positions also, right? Like new
Mhm.
hiring into certain, especially executive positions. This was another stat that was really interesting within the leads reporting of who the executives in the room were making those fun seven-figure salaries, right? It ain't us. Let me tell you, it
Definitely
ain't
not
us.
me.
Not me. So seeing this kind of wave of especially a lot of like women of color within these leadership positions also has been a huge thing I've been seeing. And just as quickly as we saw this wave bringing upon all this newness, we see the exiting process as well. I think even quicker. Um, and so it has been a lot of that because there has not been the foundation laid for through a lot of these not all, some organizations actually took a moment to think. And I think I appreciate, and I've said this many times in various places, I appreciate it when organizations don't just jump to what they think should happen. why don't you take a moment to realize, first of all, what's our role in this? What can we actually do within the community that we serve, who we are, what the field is, and like all the other, financial and everything else that goes with it. And what's the timeline for it? And I feel like that's the thing that felt missing from many of these organizations throughout this 4-year period, 2020, 2024, is a thoughtful and intentional addition of these programs and processes and structures within to their overall foundation of their organizations. So where we are, it feels different in terms of what you, like I said, the positions you see, some of the programs you see, but it feels like we're kind of sliding back now, especially
Mhm.
now. Maybe people think they've done enough and they're tired of it. So we'll
Yeah,
see.
they're tired.
They're tired.
Yeah,
Right.
we're definitely there, so there's an anthology that we have to
Hmm.
talk about today. But before we get into that and get a catch up from you since your last time on the Triloquy podcast, I just can't help but to think about an anthology that I finished. Oh, maybe a couple months ago. Is called "The Revolution Will Not Be Funded," and
Mm.
one of the arguments in that book is that when you professionalize, quote unquote, activist work by creating these chief diversity officer positions and those sorts of things, you're automatically uh, building a gate that some
Mm.
of the most radical thinking people can't get through. The only people who, I won't say only, many of the people who have these positions have been through the system to such a degree that they aren't actually going to push as hard as they need to, or maybe as hard as we would want them to. I wonder what your reactions are to that, the professionalization of quote unquote DEI work, equity work, whatever we want to call it within our sphere.
No, that's a great question because obviously the initial thought from even maybe myself during the time when I first saw, oh, Starbucks has a chief diversity officer. What does that mean? Like, what is that? I'm intrigued because I want to think that this means that they're having those conversations and that they're bringing people into the room who may know more than them on these topics. In reality, from what I have perceived of these positions and talking to people who are in these positions and working with people in these positions, is that it starts off merely by the name, right? We have someone in the room who we can say, oh, diversity person, who usually is a person of color,
Mhm.
and saying, you are now the spokesperson for all people who are not white and especially male in the room. So tell us, like, what's going on? How should we be thinking? Which is insane, as we know, right? That's like we even as ourselves, as a completely unique individual, cannot speak on the behalf of a collective because that is we are who we are as individuals.
Mhm.
So trying to, it's in a way they're going against what they're saying they're doing by kind of naming this person. The name of diversity within our office is this person, um, especially because the people who are put into these positions rarely actually get to implement the things that they want to, the practices, the procedures into the overall structure of the organizations that they're working for. They're there by name, they're there by sight, but rarely do they actually have power in that. And I'm using power in the sense of whenever you walk into the room, the person who says this is what's happening and this is when it's going to happen.
Mhm.
Rarely are the people in those diversity positions, whether it has chief in front of it or not, or even despite their pay, they could still be getting a significant amount. If you look again, go check out what's happening on those 990s. But regardless, in the room, are they being listened to? Are they being taken seriously? Are their ideas actually being implemented? That is not what I'm seeing. So it's like they're perpetuating again this thing that we already know happens, where people of color, people who are from marginalized backgrounds, are not listened to. Their thoughts, their perspectives are not being heard with or considered within these spaces, and it's still happening. Or also, these people could be overwhelmed. Like, they're still individuals. So from me myself, I always sometimes hurt when I see people of color in those positions, especially if they're women, and I'm just like, man, I know exactly why you're there, and I hope that it's not draining. And that's what I feel like is I'm seeing is this kind of like they almost, I don't want to say give up, but it's almost kind of like I'm not being listened to, and then they face the things that I'm sure they faced before in other positions, and they just happen to have this diversity title looming over them. So no, I don't. I think that maybe it started with good intentions, but that's not what we're seeing actually play out now.
We spend so much time talking about institutions do this or these
Mm,
systems X, Y, and Z, but we don't really acknowledge the fact that these institutions, these systems are made up of people. And there are
absolutely.
people with this yes, no power, as you've said, that from my perspective are hiding behind the broader systems conversations or institutions
Yep.
conversations. Who are, I almost hesitate to ask this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Who are these people hiding in the shadows of the way that we have this conversation? You know, progress isn't being held back by nothing. It's being
Mm-hmm.
held back by people, by someone. I
Mm-hmm.
wonder who you think some of these someones might be.
Ooh, ooh. I'm gonna say something. Um, I have had a really amazing opportunity within the past few years to meet a lot of like high level executives, mostly CEOs of really large institutions in the area that I'm in, which is Washington. And a lot of these executives have this, general persona of progress. They're liberal, they're like really progressive, and they want to do everything that pushes things forward. And when you actually start talking to them and you actually start hearing what they're saying and you actually start looking at what they're okaying and what they're throwing out, the people who they're hiring, the people who are in the room with the majority of the time, that's the complete opposite of what they're saying. They can go have the whatever conference conversations they have about you have to listen to your staff and you have to like think about all the perspectives in the room. Um, and unfortunately, that's how far it goes. And it's so hard, especially when these people are people of color or people from
Mm-hmm.
marginalized backgrounds for me. And it's really hard for me to, when I experience that, because I immediately walk into the room, like, oh my gosh, like, thank you, you're here. Like, even you just being here, being present in this space, I'm so grateful to see you here. And then the system, right? They're still withholding themselves within that, either fear of being removed from their position, fear of like they're going to get called out for it, not wanting to rock the boat, right? And then even let's talk about the ones who are not people of color. Like, they don't really have. There's no one's going to stop them if they don't push this more progressive agenda, right? If you're a white man CEO and you're just kind of doing things in the traditional way, your board's happy, your staff is happy, or they're probably not happy, but you won't know that, or they won't show that to you. Why would you change? It's harder,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's harder to actually do that kind of work intentionally. Um, and so these are people who are actively making decisions to stay exactly where they are and to not change anything because it is perceived to be easier. It is you won't change anything for the better, within that for that group of people who want that thing, but you don't really have to care about them. And I think that's the biggest thing is I will always go back to that, the structure of it. It is made up of people. It is people making the decisions, but also within the actual hierarchies of who matters, right? Whose happiness matters, whose enjoyment matters, which opinions matter. It's rarely the ones who we want to push that they're actually thinking about, that they actually care about. Um, yeah, so I encountering these individuals, it's still hard. They say something, and it snaps me back, and I just see this now. I see a bunch of hands and a bunch of people before them who they're just placing themselves into that position. and they themselves, they almost don't want to see themselves, I think, sometimes as individuals. They just want to hide behind the, oh, well, I'm just doing what I can within the system that is laid before me and that we exist within. I feel like I'm sounding like Kamala Harris right now. I'm so sorry.
It's a lot. We're gonna get on topic, but I just have to say real quick, season three finale. I think it's season three finale of Insecure. Okay, Molly gets her new job in the black law firm, and all they did, at least in the finale, is throw her under the bus. And I was
Mm-hmm.
so triggered by that, I couldn't watch any more of the show
Yeah.
because that is our industry is filled with that. You will walk in a room and you will see black folks, you will see people of color, and you're like, oh, okay, we here, we doing X, Y, and Z. And then, they start talking for 5 minutes and you realize, for whatever reasons, they are going along with the status quo. Now, of course, it
Exactly.
can be argued that the stakes are so high for so
Mm-hmm.
many people who look like us in these institutions. It's one thing to say something and now your coworker doesn't like you, but it's another thing to say something and now you don't have a job all of a sudden. Now you have to figure out
Right.
how to eat. So
Right.
the very I definitely agree with you when we talk about the systems overall.
Mm-hmm.
We just gotta I don't know, cultivate some courage or something.
Absolutely. No, 1000%.
But anyway, so the last time you were on Triloquy, I looked it up. It was March 2021. That was
My
a little
God.
while ago. I wonder if you can update everybody on where you've been and what you've been doing. I think you've earned a couple degrees since then.
Yeah. So during that time, March 2021, I was, I think, in my first year of my master's at the University of New Mexico doing my flute performance degree. And I was just kind of getting into this, really digging into the world of nonprofits and what that meant and what all the positions are and et cetera, et cetera. And from then, I've graduated from UNM in the spring of 2022, so a year after that appearance, and I was lucky enough to be able to continue my education immediately following that. Now I'm here in Seattle, Washington, doing my DMA in flute performance at the University of Washington. And I was also lucky enough to be awarded a fellowship with the Seattle Symphony that first year as well when I moved here in 2022 as their education and community engagement fellow. I like didn't really know that orchestras had, a education department or what even they did, and I was really, again, I had, this was me coming off of many internships and fellowships that I was doing in Albuquerque during the time because of COVID. Because of
Mhm.
COVID, I had this whole plan. I was like, okay, I'm going to go sub with this symphony and this symphony. I'm going to do all these auditions, and everything was just rocked during that time. And for me, I chose to pivot, towards this field that I saw, and I was like, well, there are people working, and there, of course, if there's an orchestra, people are picking the music and moving the chairs, and there's the conductor, right? And I just got so intrigued by this, and so all of this is all coming out of this push of 2020, what it changed for me. And I'm now a community relations manager for the Seattle Symphony. So a lot of my work, is very steeped in community, which is exactly what I wanted it to do. And it just happens to be within a symphony orchestra. So that's currently where I am and going into my last year. A cheers for me, my
Indeed.
doctorate.
Yes, yes. I wonder how your pivot on the more admin side has impacted your view on the role of musicians in an
Mm.
orchestra, if at all.
Oh, absolutely. If you work if you work in these organizations, you get to interact with musicians, performers of all different walks of life, new ones, really we have a lot of young musicians who are coming straight out of school. We have people who've been here for decades under so many different music directors, and it opened my eyes a lot. I think sometimes maybe even more than going through it myself could have, because not only am I seeing it happen in real time, I'm also seeing what it takes for us to see a symphony orchestra on a stage. There's so much that happens behind the scenes. Um, and I think the role of the musician within all of this, I think the ones who I really admire are the ones who really know what's going on,
Right.
who are not simply just showing up and just performing. And that, I mean, the truth is, there are some people who want to do that. And I think, honestly, that wave, it's kind of leaving as people retire and the older generations kind of like move on to their next steps of life. But especially the younger, like, musicians who are coming in are wanting to know, how can we help, what can we do, especially like, can we go out into the community, what can we do education wise. And that for me is where I see the most impact that musicians are having, not only just being present on stage, playing principal Beethoven, all those things. Yeah, those are great, especially when they're paired with very intentional engagement outside of just being on the concert stage.
Hmm. And I'm sure there are exceptions, but in my experience so far, I asked one of the reasons I asked that musician question is because when you start to really look at the dollars and cents, okay, ticket
Mm,
sales represent a vast minority of how orchestras are run. When
yeah.
when you start talking about funders, when you start
Hmm.
talking about development, all of those things, that is how the lights stay on. So on one hand, I really, as a musician, I will never throw all the musicians away, but it offers me so much more clarity because I feel like as musicians and especially aspiring orchestral musicians, many of us, when we hear about these orchestra strikes, when we hear about these
Mm,
orchestra lockouts, we're trained to assume that it's admin's fault or that
yep.
admin is the bad guy. But I'm sorry, I just don't have that perspective anymore. Like I
Right. Exactly. Yeah, and you can hear if you ask, the orchestra members who've been through those things, you ask them what actually was going on, then you talk to admin, and now again, yes, agreed. Now that I've heard these stories and I've been on this side, on in the admin side, I'm like, oh no, oh okay, oh, and this, I can't remember what orchestra it was, who, once the public found out how much money they were actually making and what the fact that they were striking because of that, actually the community turned against them. They turned against the musicians, like, how dare you, like, ask for more when half of us are making like under 60K, below the poverty line. And it's, I think very often, we get very wrapped into our little cocoons and our bubbles of the space, the very one dimensional spaces that we exist within, and we stop taking into account what's actually going on around us. And I think that is my exactly my point, actually, about when musicians are actually aware of what is going around them. That means, what is the average like living, like cost, what's the cost of living in the city you're playing in, what's the average like salary, like hourly rate for people in your city. And then let's talk a little bit about that and how, you fit within that ecosystem. Of course, usually the arts and humanities is generally some of the lowest paid employees within a community and a region. But when it comes to like symphony orchestras specifically, and like opera houses, ballet, we can just say all like the big three within a city, sometimes they're the ones who kind of skew that a little bit, right? They're a little
Mhm.
heavier on that side. So there have definitely been a lot of, I think, again, the musicians who I'm seeing who are really understanding what is going on outside of that stage and that concert hall are the ones who are less likely to do that kind of pushing back, if that makes, and like, I'm not saying that there's never been a strike lockout that's been an admin like major issue, because of course there has been, but also whenever these things come up about musician pay and up like raises, I wonder what would happen if there was a panel in the room of people who were, of teachers, of educators, my God, who would dream of making 70K, right, a
Mhm.
year.
Much
um,
less, the fact that there are many orchestras where the musicians make more than double that.
exactly, or as base salary, let's add that as
Right,
well.
right. I mean, and I just have to, and I want to make it clear to everyone listening, I'm not just sitting here to shit on musicians. What I am saying is that you have development directors, you have all sorts of people who are bending over backwards to make sure that that music stand is there,
Mm,
to make sure that,
mm,
that much less the music is printed for you
mm,
and all of those things. So my hope
exactly.
is just for folks to, especially musicians, to get that broader perspective. But it's actually a broader perspective that you have put into the world through the publishing
Mm,
of From Our Eyes and Ears.
mm.
Before we get into it in its specificity, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the anthology format. I talked about the anthology that I read not too long ago. I think last time you were on TRILLOQUY, you actually were talking a bit about an anthology. I wonder if you could, for folks who may not know, describe what this format is and how you came to the
Yeah.
decision of creating an anthology as opposed to a novel or a textbook or the many other ways in which this could have been presented to the world.
Oh, yeah. I love this question because I get to speak about a piece of work that really inspired From Our Eyes and Ears, which is this bridge called My Back, which
Right,
is
that's right. Yeah.
writings by radical women of color, edited by Sherry Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa. And this was the anthology that I was reading during my women, music, and feminist theory class during the, like, I think, winter quarter of 2021. And this, first of all, it's called a narrative anthology from what I when I was like reading into this format of what it really was, because people think anthology, they think this catalog, right, of all these different works, which it is in one sense. This being a narrative anthology was a collection of writings based on and by radical women of color and like femininity by women of color and what that meant, feminism through the lens of women of color. And it was not just one writer, it was multiple people who were included within this. And it was so, for me, it showed me so much how important perspective and having these multiple perspectives into one thing together, this one whole to represent a bigger topic, a bigger subject, a bigger point. And this is also something that I noticed a lot during the time of 2020, whenever, I mean, I was graduating. This was my last year of undergrad whenever the pandemic hit, and whenever the murder of George Floyd happened, and all the conversations on racial inequities really started peaking around this time. Is when I saw someone on Twitter sharing, this hashtag Black at Harvard, and she was speaking to her experiences as like usually the only Black woman in her classes at Harvard getting her degree. And it really inspired me to share a lot of my own personal experiences that I've gone through being like a Black student within, at a PWI and just within the classical music field. And I like used that formatting. I was like, okay, hashtag Black in the arts. And I like went on like Facebook and I just shared a few of the stories that had happened to me. And it like people were like commenting, going crazy, sharing it. And I think the reason, I don't think it was just because it was me. I think
Mm-hmm.
it was the fact that I really, up until that point, had never really talked about my experiences. I think people saw me and they were like, oh, look, it's Lorin. It's great. It's like, yes. And I've also gone through a lot of things that I'm sure other people have gone through within the field. And I think from that and the fact that this was a point of entry for me talking to people who hadn't really known that this was an issue within the field. And I saw how this was getting conversation started. People started using the hashtag. They were sharing it. They were sharing their own experiences. I think even that year at KSU, my alma mater, they did their Black History show, and they used the I think the title was like hashtag Black in the Arts, and they really expounded on what this actually means. And so this felt like it reconnected me within this time frame when I was reading this bridge called My Back. And I was like, oh my God, perspective matters so much. Sharing, it's not, sometimes the facts and statistics work well in certain formats. But for me, what I had saw was the most impactful in my own experience was sharing of personal thoughts, personal stories to uncover this, what the hidden truth was that people, some of us, we have lived it, right? But other people who have not had the experience of being a person of color within the field may never know what it's like to go through this. And so that's it all, it made sense. I was like, it can't just be me. It needs to be more than me. And we have to have the same, like it, the point of it has to drive home. It has to be that it is not just one of us. It's many of us. If in most cases, it's majority of us who've gone through these things together and we're trying to say that this is happening. So that's where the formatting really came from. And I stick by this to the day that it's the format that makes the most sense for what we're really trying to drive home.
You know, you reminded me of a quote that I had to pull up. Zora Neale Hurston: if you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. Is
Mm,
really something I think specifically for people of color in the arts to understand, that we have to speak up because folks think it's just fine over here, like that
yep.
we are not suffering, that everything is right, you know. So, you know, I know there are people, you know, and I do think it's an interesting balance as far
Mm,
as, you know, it can't all be about the oppression. It can't all be about the pain. But if we
right.
don't share it at all, you know,
Hmm.
the opposite assumptions are made and there's no forward progress. To that
Mm,
end, I wonder if you could speak to curating these perspectives. What
hmm.
went into your decision to mix poetry with interview format to just essay writing, everything that's in
Hmm.
this anthology?
Yeah. Honestly, from the point of me thinking, okay, this has to happen. I had a really amazing mentor, Dr. Alonzo Minuti, who is at University of New Mexico, who was the person who really like pushed me to do this. And she was like, use this class, use your project for the class as a stepping stone towards this project. And so really with, that help in that space to do so, I really had a moment and opportunity to think about what would this look like? Who would be the people who are part of this? And I was again, from seeing the stories being shared, it wasn't just students, it wasn't just professional musicians, it wasn't just admin, it wasn't just educators, it was all of us who were
Mm-hmm.
having these experiences. And I think because of that, I was like, great, so we need to show that it can't just be one, again, this one layered thing where it only happens in music school or only happens to educators, it only happens to musicians. It needs to show that this is a common thing, a common thread, that links us. And so that is kind of where I got the contributors, in my brain, like this is who needs to be. So I went down, and that's kind of who it's made up of, is a breadth of people from different backgrounds. While the first volume specifically is on Black voices, but different professions, different like levels of where they were within their careers and their educations. Um, and then the formatting, I didn't want it to be just one thing, because I think another thing about trying to combat this, the idea that the stigma of what just Black is one thing, and that the fact that that is what I had been speaking to so often within my own personal experiences, is how they would assume so much just by looking at me, exactly who I was and who, like, what the things that I valued were. And I also understood that sharing experiences can be so personal that I didn't even want to say, this is the format in which you must stay within.
Mm-hmm.
It felt very disingenuous for me to engage in that kind of structuring, when the whole point of this is to show the individuality while also showing the common thread. So that is kind of what, and then, with my editor, Lavana, shout out Lavana, like I was just basically like, is this something doable? Is this something that can kind of make sense? And we're like, yeah, as long as we curate it for it to really fall into that kind of narrative where it feels like you're reading through a story of many people. And every time I pick it up, and just before this, obviously, I was like reading through um, a lot of the different contributions that are in here, and it really does feel like there's just this long thread that moves as you move throughout the anthology, even if it's talking about mental health, imposter syndrome, or if it's talking about intersectionality, being Black, gay, being a woman, being Black, just self-worth, belonging, all these different themes that pop up within the anthology. There's still this thread that it happened to me, and it happened to the person before me, and it happened to the person after me, so that's kind of the process of what we thought going into this. We just wanted to give space, really.
And obviously I can never ask you to, you know, pick out your favorite contributions or anything like that, but just to give folks a taste, I wonder if there's an excerpt or a specific narrative that you could offer just as a preview for folks who haven't looked at this yet?
Mm. You know, it is hard. It's so hard to, because I was trying to read through and think about who I would I even point out, and all of them are so they capture the point in such a different way. But I think first of all, Marcel Benoit's which I we chose as the first off the cuff because of how the name of it just strikes you immediately, which is played like an instrument, fought like an animal.
Mm.
And I was like, oh my God. I was like, where are we going with this? And I'm so intrigued. And what I loved and what I'm pointing out about Marcel's entry is the first of all bringing this into context of the world we exist within. The excerpt starts: since the first slave ship landed on American soil, Black people have been imposed with needing a purpose, which I thought just was already so heavy but connecting. And so we're starting off from this idea of this is what we inherited, right? He goes on to say, for Black people, there's no opportunity for us to just exist, only to be used as some sort of pawn in a predominantly white world. This concept has infiltrated our community and has manifested as generational trauma for many BIPOC, thus affecting our roles as musicians. This is one of the first things that you read within the anthology after my introduction, and a little bit of the editor's notes. And again, it just kind of ties in this idea. I know we've been talking about systems and we've been talking about the individual. And I think we have to think about, again, even with the conversation we're having about musicians and the ones who are making the most impact, knowing what's going on around you to understand what's happening in front of you and directly around you and what you can change. I think I loved how this was the thing that we chose to start off and just kind of connecting us all throughout this from the start of the anthology. Again, all of them are so significant in their own ways and so powerful in a multitude of ways. And honestly, I'm honored to have had the opportunity to share these stories. And I hope that it just ends up in more and more hands, as the years go on.
It's interesting that even outside of an exclusively or a particularly musical context, we still have to think about audience, even though in
Mm,
this case, the audience is made up of readers.
right.
Considering the fact that Black folks in the field will likely not read anything in this anthology that is new or is a
Mhm.
shocker of any type. I wonder who you were thinking about, or maybe who you now think about as the primary audience for this book. Again, considering the fact that we know how we're treated. Okay.
Absolutely.
So who is this for?
That's a really great question because it is true. The fact that we live this experience, I'm sure people are like already flicking through this going, yep, that happened to me. Yep, that happened to me. But also, while there are people there's a big audience who's going to get this in their hands who have never experienced this ever in their lives, and they're going to go, oh my God, oh my gosh, and that's going to be their expression throughout. They're just going to feel heavy right as they're reading it. And that's the point about reading, learning about perspectives outside of your own, is to get understand what others go through. So there is that. If you are not a person of color who's experienced, being a part of the classical field or other fields, just being a person of color, being Black in this instance, you're going to learn and see through a different lens in which you've never had to exist through. But I also, whenever we were first sending this out to, and I had people just kind of browsing through reading, giving their, their recommendations and everything, I had many people thank me who are Black people, Black orchestral musicians in the field, Black just like artists, who were like, it was so healing. Part of
Mm.
it was healing of reading through this, and this idea of like they didn't feel alone. They felt like because they had gone through something similar and they were reading that it had happened to someone else, in a way it felt like it was a moment of connection and something that a lot of them said that they did need. So it also brought to me this understanding of the importance of sharing those stories when we get together, even if we are from the same perspective, same background. we still talk about it, right? It's something that we still want to be in community around. And I think it's because we want to keep the progress moving. We want to remind ourselves that there's still work to be done, and that, first of all, we are a community and we're going through this together, and we have each other to lean on during these times when these situations and experiences, and to talk to somebody when those experiences happen. I can't say how many people probably have been the only person in their ensembles, at their schools, that they're teaching at, their orchestras, where they have to go through these things alone. And the truth is, you don't have to. We're out here, and we are here to be in community with each other. So I would have to say that it's not just non POC who are going to pick this up and get something from it. I think they're those of us who may be reading these stories really could feel like a moment of connection for you. And for me, it has been for me.
I want to ask you how putting together this anthology has impacted the way you read. And, I asked that question because, I've had the great honor of contributing to a number of anthologies at this point, and including this one. And now that when I'm reading, especially when I'm reading an anthology, I'm really taking it in as a moment in time, because there are so many things that I've written that have been published that would be different if I wrote it
Yes.
right now, and would be different if I wrote it 10 years from now. So that is just always something that I'm thinking about as I'm reading other people's work, that this is what they wrote then. Things could be different, things could have evolved or whatever, but that's how I need to take this in. I wonder if there are other ways in which the way you take in this type of media has changed now that you've been on the production side of it.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I can relate it actually so much to performing a work and hearing a recording of yourself from 5, 10 years ago.
Mm.
I will listen to myself playing pieces in high school, and I'm like, oh, okay, I hear what I was going for. I'm so glad to hear the confidence in which I did those things within. But obviously, I know now, with the perspective, the newer perspectives, and the growth that I've had as an individual, I would play that differently now, just because I have had more time. And I think that, especially with this being like the first time I've ever had anything published, and the fact that this is my first ever experience of curating something, a narrative anthology like this, I already know for future things, there are going to be things that are different. There maybe even the process, maybe it's going to look different people being brought in from different perspectives. And even with this one, there possibly could have been things that were done differently, depending, especially now who I am 4 years, or I guess from that point, 3 years um, ago. And I don't really necessarily, I know sometimes, especially like within social media, and once you start kind of adding those things in, it's kind of a point where people start using to blame and point fingers at people, like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, but you said this at this point. And I think I understand authors and editors of this format a lot more, because I've gone through this process, and I understand that even though it feels more like it's physical, it's in your hand, um, that was still a capture of that moment of time.
Right.
This, all of us, I'm sure, would change certain things we've said, or it would be maybe even completely different in terms of how we would format it. But I think I'm still very proud, and I think I will still be very proud of this work, as I hope that many authors and writers of this format feel proud within their first few, or the first thing they've ever done. It's like, yeah, that was that time, and now I'm here. And so all that I can ask of myself, um, and the people around me, is to continue growing, and to continue having grace, and be thankful that you were there so that now you're here, and just being happy that I even had the opportunity to do this, and that this is going to grow. Other opportunities are going to come out of this. So that's where I feel on it.
And not to say that there aren't aspects that are very much, oh, I said what I said,
Yeah,
but I do think it's
exactly.
important to just acknowledge that, we're all growing, we're all
Absolutely.
evolving. Yeah, absolutely. Well, how can people learn more about you and keep up with your next steps, especially as you are working on becoming Dr. Green?
Oh man. I have my website that, it's a little bit about me if you want to, just see a little bit of what I've done. It's just my name, Lorin, Lorin Green, like the color.com. It used to be LorinGreenFlute.com, but I think because of so much that has changed in my life and like the focus, that I think I'm more than just one thing now. And I love
Period.
that about myself. So yeah, that's where you can find me. Also on social media, just say hi if you want to. I think I still am LorinGreen.flute on Instagram, but that could be changing soon. But that's where you can find me.
Yeah, it's like Jay-Z said, don't call me a rapper, don't call me a
Right.
cartoonist.
Exactly.
And where can people purchase From Our Eyes and Ears?
Yes. So if you want to purchase it directly from our press, you can go to aquariuspress.myshopify.com and you can just search for From Our Eyes and Ears, writings by musicians of color. You can also find it on other local shops online, also on Amazon if that's your jam as well. But that's how you can find it. Also on my website, you can see it as well.
And I'll plug because here I'm always reading something,
Mhm.
especially being on the train and all this stuff here in New York. So I'll just offer my personal plug to say that it's definitely not um how can I say it's not intimidatingly long. Like
No,
it's definitely a book that you can just sit down and read. You don't have to worry about
absolutely.
feeling like you're holding a dictionary in your hand.
No.
The narratives are so personal. It doesn't feel like
Mhm.
you're reading a textbook. So I just really want to congratulate you not only conceptually for this, but also physically for it. It's really great to have this book on my shelf. I'm very proud of it.
Well, thank you, and thank you to you, and congratulations to yourself for being a part of this, and to have another, more of your words and your thoughts out in the world. And we need more of it. And that's all I can ask, is that we just continue sharing, what we're feeling and what we're thinking out with, ourselves and the community, and that's how we go forward.
Well, I wanted to wrap up by circling back to these big institutional systemic things that
Mm.
we talk about. As you know, there's a diversity of thought surrounding Black participation in classical music moving forward. There are people that say we need to continue to infiltrate and change it from the inside. There are some people that saying we just need to mind our own business and build our own things and not worry about all of this stuff that it has no track record of serving us on the systemic level that we're looking for and everything in between. I wonder what your view on that is in closing. Why is the so-called classical field worth engaging for folks like us?
Well, I mean, we're here, and there have been people whose lives have been significantly impacted also positively through this field, as with many others. But, I see it as, why not all of it? Why not, while we also are creating our own spaces, our own places, that we can understand that people have also made a home for themselves within, the classical music world, and that is where they find themselves at their fullest level of impact. And I think for me, that's the thing, is impact. Where can you yourself as an individual feel like you are doing the most positive within your community, within the world? And that's where you should be. That could be making your own thing, that could be joining on to a friend's new thing, that could be staying exactly where you are with an institution that maybe was not made for you, but it could be for you, possibly. And I think it's the hope, that with the work that we can do, especially together, especially with intention, especially with awareness of what's happening in the world, that it's worth it, and it can be worth it. And so why not all? Why limit ourselves?
A solo flute work there by the late great Afro American composer Ulysses K. performed, of course, by soon to be Dr. Lorin Green. Huge thanks to her once again for coming onto the show. Be sure to go order your copy of From Our Eyes and Ears wherever you shop for books online. There's a link in the description of this opus for you to check out. It's a really incredible collection of perspectives that any and every change maker needs to have on their shelves. Hope y'all enjoyed our conversation. All right, so as far as a triloquy this week, there are two things that I want to look at really briefly. First and foremost, rest in power to Sonya Massey. The police officer that killed her has a clear record of not being able to keep a job, and it looks like his karma is following him. The officer has officially been charged with murder, with a trial and sentencing to come. I also want to acknowledge the millions of dollars that were raised literally overnight in support of Kamala Harris's presidential campaign. We have money to support the state and its actors, but we don't have money to support Black liberation. I think these two events have something very important in common. I think they represent our inability to access structures and systems that will change our realities for the better and in a radical and meaningful way. And by radical, again, I mean at the root. At the root. We really aren't changing the root of the problem. We're clipping the weeds from the flower from above the ground, but we aren't really getting down into the rut of the issue. And in many ways, we don't really have the tools to do so. You know, in the case of Sonya Massey, a call to the police ended up killing her. She was looking for help. She thought there was a prowler, and here she is dead. Now, don't mishear what I'm saying. I'm not placing any blame on Sonya. What I'm doing is highlighting the fact that a structure that should have protected her and that should have served her killed her. I'm thinking about the same thing with the presidential campaign. I'm not saying that people should abandon Kamala Harris and not support what she's trying to do. I'm saying that the same United States government, and more specifically, the same Democratic National Convention and Democratic Party whose hands are tied when it comes to reparations, whose hands are tied when it comes to student loans, to housing, wages, you name it. They're getting the money that could transform community organizing and education at the grassroots level everywhere. My friends who were assigned female at birth are telling me that they're trying to figure out what to do about their monthly cycles now because it's come to the front that the pads and the tampons have lead in them. Where's the government to do something about that? I could go on, of course, but I hope my point is being heard. Now, it's not our fault that our systems have failed us and continue to fail us. That must be acknowledged. I'm not placing any blame on any individual person here. It's also not our fault that these oppressive and deadly systems are ones that, under the circumstances, are ones that we have to engage at some point or another. But we do have to develop the courage to cultivate the consciousness to understand that there's something better out there for us. We tend to give up on our imaginations when we can't paint the exact picture of what this something better looks like. And we have to stop doing that. It's time for us to decide as a populace that the chances of being killed by the police, even when we're calling on their help, is too high to justify. We have to try to accept the fact that there is something else out there other than what we have. Now, let's face it. You mean to tell me that this officer who killed Sonya was surrounded by gentle-hearted, culturally competent, thoughtful people? How can someone who has the professional record he has and the propensity to murder exist among colleagues who have a heart? Where are these good police officers that everyone wants to tell us exist? They obviously didn't work or have interaction with that officer, right? Now, again, I hate that I have to, keep qualifying what I'm saying. I'm not saying that the quote unquote good police officer doesn't exist. I'm just saying he must not have been there that day, right? Same thing for the U.S. government. Hunger would be ended in our country if resources were distributed and utilized toward that end. But instead, we're funding genocide. We're protecting private business and private property. And we're investing in media that blinds people from the fact that the political right and what we call the political left in this country are two wings of the same bird. I mean, people have the nerve to talk about the economy under President Biden when stock market numbers and employment percentages tell less than half the story. Maybe you have investments that have done extremely well, but you know what? I don't, and neither do the people I'm in community with. Yes, unemployment is down if you look at the numbers, but are we really considering underemployment? Everybody out here is working hard. Really, the poorer you are, the harder you work, and the material results of that work just don't match what people are alleging. Now, to connect all of this to the arts, I think we got to take the same proof and evidence-based perspectives into account. Are our institutions really doing anything about the cultural hegemony that keeps orchestras and opera audiences disproportionately white and disproportionately male at that when we talk about who's being featured on these stages? Is the nonprofit arts sector any less money hungry and money driven than any other corporate structure in the United States? Has the intentional inclusion of people from historically excluded communities dismantled the status quo in classical music, or has it actually strengthened it? I have answers to those questions, but in the name of change, I encourage you to think about your own answers and to see how they relate to the path toward liberation. And that is, if that's something that you're interested in. My personal ethos regarding classical music is related to my wish for a society, and at the very least, an American society where people aren't starving and living on the streets. Our work must have a connection to these larger societal issues. Otherwise, we need not pretend that we actually care about Sonya Massey or the direction of our country in general. Go into your checking account today, pull a few dollars out, and find someone on the streets to give them to. It may not save the world, and it may not even save that person, but it'll be you doing more than our systems tend to, at least in these cases. Thanks again for listening. Let's do something good for someone. Nam Yoho Renge Kyo, Nam Yoho Renge Kyo, Nam Yoho Renge Kyo. Peace.